Hi, it's Pat Ham here, and I know I haven't posted a video in a long time, just because life has kind of been in the way of things, but I've been noodling around a lot with my guitar, and unfortunately not doing so much production as much as just kind of plugging the guitar in and just kind of playing around. So I thought I'd take a couple of minutes today to just kind of babble about guitars. So if you don't use Reason for rock music, or if you're not a guitar player, this might not really be the video for you. I just kind of wanted to babble a little bit about some things that I've been thinking about with regard to how I approach using guitars in Reason and recording rock music. So Reason is my only DAW. I don't use anything else ever since Record came out. Before that, I was using Sonar to record all of my audio. But now, these days, I only use Reason. So my primary plug-in format is rack extensions, as you could probably guess. And as a guitar player, it's probably no surprise that I gravitate to the Kawasa guitar amp plugins. As you can see from my effects list here, I've got a lot of Kawasa plugins. And if you look closely, you can see that I have all of the amp emulations that Kawasa has ever released. I'm a big fan of these plugins. I just love the way they work. I love the way they sound. And anytime I come across another Reason user, or fellow guitar player for that matter, I always mention to them how awesome these plugins are and that Kawasa is at least worth a look. First, I wanted to start by giving a couple of tips about how I use the Kawasa plugs. First of all, wait for sales. If you don't have any Kawasa plugins and you're thinking about diving in, Kawasa has frequent sales. And actually, as I'm recording this, it's about a month and a couple of days before Christmas 2022. They're probably going to have a sale, maybe starting next week for Black Friday, maybe even tomorrow. Who knows? They usually have sales around the end of the year, but they have sales frequently. So wait for sales. If Reason is not your primary DAW, you may want to consider the VST versions of these plugins instead. So I would urge you to go over to Kawasa's website and have a look at that so you can make the best judgment. So this is just my personal opinion, but if you don't have any Kawasa plugins and you're a guitar player and you're thinking about starting, my personal opinion is that you want to try to get 2 amps. One for dirty tones and one for clean tones. And the ones that I always come back to are Caliburn for dirty and Matchlock for clean. Now, of course, always make use of the 30-day trial period, but these are the two that I really come back to more than any others. In my opinion, they sound the greatest and they have been the most versatile for me. Now, again, as you use the 30-day demos, you may think differently. But again, for dirty, I go for Caliburn most of the time. And for clean, I go to Matchlock. Now let's hear these. Let's take a little listen to them. I have this really, really simple guitar part that I recorded. Let's have a listen. All right, so very, very straightforward, but let's throw in a Caliburn and just listen to the default preset. I mean, that already sounds good. And actually, when I'm working with these Kawasa plugins, I often find that the presets are actually really good. I really like the way that they sound. This particular one, Caliburn, has 3 amps. They all do. They all have 3 amps that you could choose from. I find that I really like the 45 the best. So let's, for example, take a listen to this 45 Crunch. So that's just kind of to me, that sounds kind of like an old school AC/DC kind of tone, something like that. But I really like that one. I use this as a starting point a lot, this 45 crunch. It also has some good clean tones though, so I don't want anybody to think that I only use Caliburn for dirty tones. For example, this clean strat preset. It's got a little bit of overdrive, but it does a really good job of, cleaner tones. Here's a super clean, the 800 super clean. Now let's replace this with my other favorite rack extension from Kawasa. We browse down to it. Matchlock. Now if I go drag this over, let's listen to how Matchlock sounds. Again, I use Matchlock primarily for clean tones, but it has some surprises up its sleeve too. Matchlock, as I understand, is Fender emulations, and I used to have a Fender amp, so I really like the sound of this, and maybe it's my bias because I love Fender amps, but in any case, I can also get a nice gritty tone out of this one as well. My favorite preset is the C nice breakup. But usually I use Caliburn for dirty and Matchlock for clean tones. Usually if I'm using Matchlock for dirty tones, I'll put the overdrive in front of it. But I'm not talking about the overdrive right now. I'm just talking about my favorite amps of Kawasa. By the way, speaking of these little pedals, everybody who has not yet gone to the rack extension store and downloaded the freebies needs to go and get the Effector silencer noise gate and the Effector GQ3607 graphic EQ. Those are free from Kawasa and they're really great. And of course, as a guitar player, I'd use the noise gate on every single guitar track that I ever record. So it's nice to have the noise gate rack extension. Now, you're probably wondering, what's the point of this since all of the Kawasa plugins have built-in noise gates? And the reason is very simple. I can gate my signal here, and this is my settings for gating the signal. So I don't know if you'll hear it actually with the guitar part that I recorded, but so I'm gating the signal there. Why wouldn't I gate the signal here instead? It's easier with one plugin. Well, I might want to switch this out with another plugin. And if that's the case, all of my gate settings have now changed. Now this is the exact same gate settings, but here I keep my settings, and here I lose my settings because I've replaced it with a new amp and I have to go and dial that back in again. So it might seem a little bit more complicated, but in my opinion, it makes more sense to use the silencer before any amp and not to use the built-in noise gate. Sometimes I use the built-in noise gate if I know that I'm super happy with the sound that I'm getting and that I am pretty close to finished with that song, and I know that I'm not going to be replacing amps. But if I'm just goofing off, or if I'm not yet sure what my guitar tone is going to be like, I will use the silencer before the amp. So I just showed you that Caliburn can do clean and it can do dirty, and Matchlock can do clean and it can do dirty. So why would I suggest getting 2 amps? Because I can plug them in series. So I'll put one in here, go back to my plugins, and put a Matchlock after it. Now, why would I want to do this? Well, the reason is because the amplifier and the cabinet are both selectable. You can turn them on or off. So what that means is that I can have my amp on for Caliburn and cabinets off. And then I can have my amp off for Matchlock and cabinets on. So what I'm getting is my Caliburn amp into Matchlock cabinets. So this gives me the opportunity to have 3 amps going into different cabinets, not just being stuck with the cabinets that are built into the plugin. So let's just hear how this sounds. I mean, who knows if that sounds good, of course, because we're not hearing it in a mix. But the point is, I am not stuck with just the cabinets on the single rack extensions. And the same is true the opposite way. So I will shift drag. So now Matchlock is coming first. As we can see, if we flip the rack, now it's going into Matchlock and then out to Caliburn. So I'll turn my cabinets off for Matchlock, and I will turn my amp off for Caliburn. So now I have a Matchlock amp going into Caliburn cabinets. So this gives us a lot of options just having these 2 amps, but it actually goes even farther than that, because the Softube amp is also split by amp and cabinet. And we can bypass the amp and do the same exact thing here. So now I have Matchlock going into amps cab. And once again, I can reverse them. So now I can turn off the amp, turn back on my cabinets, bypass the cabinet, and select one of these options for amp. I think the amp is a really great rack extension, but I don't like this stuff. Twang, crunch, rock, lead. I prefer the way that Kawasa does it, just because they tell us in the documentation what amp this is. It's not based on a style that I'm picking the amp. It's based on the actual amp. And the same is true for the cabinets. Bright, room, fat, tight. I mean, they sound good, and I do like this rack extension, but I just don't like having these style words to describe my cabinets. I much prefer, I know that this is a 1x12. I know this is a 1x12, etc. So, I mean, again, you may not use the amp so much. You may use it all the time. But this gives us even more flexibility, because now mixing and matching between Softube and Kawasa gives us that many more options to choose from. So I know that I just said that if you're on a budget and you're just getting started, that I would recommend 2 of the amplification amps. And as I said, my choices would be Caliburn and Matchlock, but of course, try them all. Make use of that 30-day trial. Lancaster, for example, is another really good one for clean tones and dirty tones. Kawasa is really good about documentation, describing which amps they are emulations of. They're really great. Another thing that's worth considering is that some of the Kawasa plugins also have extra effects on them that you can use. So for example, let's grab Matchlock. This will be my amp. I'll pull in that C nice breakup, which I really like. All right, so let's go back to our list of Kawasa amps. My favorite example of Kawasa amps that have built-in effects that we can use is vermilion. If you pull vermilion in above match lock, now I'm not going to use the amp in vermilion, I'm going to use the effects on vermilion. Vermilion has a tremolo and it has a spring reverb, both of which are really great. They sound awesome. So what I do a lot is turn off the amp and turn off the cabs, and the effects is on. I still have access to this effect, even though my amp and my cabinets are off. So now I have, well, the tremolo is off, but right now I have a reverb going into my match lock. And to my ears, I really like the Kawasa spring reverb sound on the vermilion. If I don't want it, I can turn it all the way down, and let's start talking about our tremolo. So as you can see, I am able to use the effects on the vermilion into the match lock. Another great example of this is Cream. Once again, I can turn off the amp, disable the cabinets, but I still have this effects section, which is basically an overdrive pedal. And I can still use that into my match lock. Now, Reason has no shortage of distortion effects. This is just an example of one other thing that you have available to you. So my next thought, my next babble about recording guitars in Reason. When tracking in Reason, I always take notes of my settings. As a home recording artist, it is very likely that I will record a track, and when life gets in the way, revisit that track weeks or months, sometimes even years later. If I need to re-record a guitar part, I want it to match as best as I can. I want it to sound like something that I record today. If I record overdubs a month from now, they sound exactly the same. A year from now, everything sounds exactly the same. For this, I use the Jiggery Pokery Commentator REs. And again, these are free rack extensions. You need to go right now to the rack extension store and download the commentators. Maybe not right now because you're watching this video, but as soon as you can. If you don't have them yet, go and get them from the Reason store. They are free. So they're over in Utilities under Jiggery Pokery, and there are 3 of them. There's a 1U, there's a 4U, and there's a 9U. Now, actually, for my guitar settings, the 1U is enough for me. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag this in and make notes about my session. Now, it's not very clear at first, but if you click on these areas over here, you can write notes. So I'm going to just put this one right in the middle. And let's say, for example, I recorded this guitar part today, and I want to remember exactly what was happening on that day. So I'll put in notes like, for example, I told you I have 2 guitars. I have a red one and I have a black one. So I'll say red guitar humbucker. What else do I want to write about this? As much information as you can so that you can recreate that take as best as you can. So I'll put, for example, new strings. I just changed my strings last week. And then next, on this next line, I mean, you could do it as you see fit, but what I do is I put notes about the guitar and notes about the input level. And I will even put interface. NI complete 6. That is my audio interface. If it breaks tomorrow, I want to remember that I recorded this guitar part on the NI Complete 6. I hope it doesn't break tomorrow. And if I don't revisit this song for another year, and I have since then bought a new interface and maybe it's not the Complete 6, this will be useful for me to know, maybe it'll be harder for me to match the tone. Maybe I need to re-record the whole part, but this gives me some context about what I was doing and what interface I was doing it on. And it was input 2, input at 3 o'clock. So this is my notes about the session. I do this for every guitar part I ever record, just in case I have to come back to it a long time from now. If I come back to this in a year and I see this, I have to do overdubs here. I want to fix a part and I want the parts to match. What if my strings have not been changed? Well, maybe I want to change my strings before I record this part. So again, go over to the Rack Extension store. These are called the commentators. They are free. Go and download them. So now a couple of thoughts about doubling. I do mostly rock, so I do a lot of guitar doubling, as you can imagine. With rock songs, it's very common, as we all know, to be playing the same guitar part both on the left and on the right. So I am lucky enough to have two guitars, and I have one tuned down to D. So when I double, I do not use one guitar for both left and right. I use my red guitar, which is tuned to E, and on the other side, I use the black guitar, which is tuned to D. This means that I learn the part on the D guitar, and it's going to have different chords, different phrasings of chords, and even before I do any mixing, the doubled guitars will already sound more interesting and dynamic, since the tone and phrasing is going to be different. If you only have one guitar, I would suggest that you take the time to learn to play that guitar part using different phrasings on the neck. Playing the same guitar part and doubling, it does a lot to widen the sound, but in my experience, different phrasings or using a different guitar, it's much more interesting to listen to. What also helps is that I do not use the same amp on both left and right. So we've been talking a lot about these Kawasa amps, and as I've mentioned, I have all of them. I have a little bit of gear acquisition syndrome when it comes to these Kawasas. I feel like every time one comes out, I always have to snatch it up. So I have a little bit too much to choose from, quite frankly. I would probably be better off if I had less. But the point is, left guitar, if I'm using Caliburn, I do not use Caliburn on the right side. I'll use something different, like maybe Rectifor. Or Vermilion's got some really good crunchy tones as well, and I just got the VVV, which I'm also finding is really, really great. One final little thing I'd like to babble about with regard to recording, and this is not just for guitars, but it works very well with guitars, and particularly with guitar solos. I have a technique which I have named the second day final take, which works really great for me, and you might want to try it. Once I know a guitar part really well, of course you have to practice before you even press the record button, but once I know a guitar part really well, I will lay down a final take. I think that's pretty commonplace. I think that's what we all do. But when I'm really happy with it, great, I'm good to go. But then 1 or 2 days later, I lay it down again. 9 times out of 10, my second day final take turns out better than the one that I was happy about. So, the second day final take. Try it, maybe it'll work for you. It works great for me. So, that's a lot of babbling. I hope that wasn't too boring. I hope you found that interesting. Please let me know in the comments if you have anything that you'd like to add, or if you have any other comments or questions about how I use guitars, how I use these awesome Kawasa plugs, or anything else. Take it easy, everybody. And I will see you in the next video.